Their scientific designation is Orcinius orca, but orca whales have been known by a variety of names over time, most of which are highly inaccurate portrayals of these magnificent marine mammals. For starters, orca whales are not actually whales at all, but belong to the dolphin family. To indigenous peoples, orcas were known simply as blackfish, a name that is also marginally. Their scientific designation is Orcinius orca, but orca whales have been known by a variety of names over time, most of which are highly inaccurate portrayals of these magnificent marine mammals. For starters, orca whales are not actually whales at all, but are actually dolphins. And to indigenous peoples, orcas were known as blackfish, a name that is only marginally fitting for a non-fish species that are nearly as much white as they are black. But the most popular orca names of the past promote a false personality of viciousness and violence. Although there is no verifiable record of a wild orca ever injuring a human being, their effectiveness as hunters of prey has led to monikers such as killer whales, assassin whales, sea wolves, and even murder pandas. While keeping our distance from what we once observed as ferocious predators of the sea, for many centuries humans had no idea that orcas are highly intelligent and surprisingly gentle creatures. And when we finally learned the truth, this knowledge came at a great cost to many unfortunate orcas. Today's monologue will be a sad one as I report on the travesties that humankind has inflicted on one of the most beautiful and undeserving creatures to ever grace this planet. But my story begins much more innocently, with me as a young boy, inexplicably fascinated by an animal I had seen only in photographs. I've adored orcas for as long as I can remember. But growing up in the state of Maine, some 3,000 miles away from the Pacific Northwest, where orcas were commonly encountered, I never had the privilege of seeing one in real life. This was during the 70s and 80s when marine park killer whale shows were at the height of popularity. But my family didn't go on vacations. So, to feed my obsession, I devoured every book I could find, and loved listening to audio tapes of orchestral recordings mixed with the exotic dialect of orcas in their wild, falling asleep to their rhythmic calls. I learned as much as I could about orcas, yet I never fully satisfied my childhood curiosity. Again, I never saw an orca up close until I was a teenager on a school trip to Orlando, Florida. Our group spent a day at SeaWorld, and needless to say, I was in heaven. I had no idea that the delightful animals that seemed to be so happily performing in shows were in fact suffering under the facade of their frolics. But oddly enough, a few days later, after that visit to SeaWorld, I saw a trailer for the movie Free Willy on the television in my hotel room. It was this movie that sparked a first tiny inkling of an idea in my mind that orcas and other marine mammals simply do not belong in captivity. It was the summer of 1993, and the whole world seemed to cheer as 12-year-old Jesse freed Willie the orca from a tiny, lonesome tank into a vast ocean of fellow whales. But viewers couldn't help but notice the hypocrisy of such a triumphant movie moment. Sure, the fictional Willie was free, but what about the orca actor who played the role? The public soon learned that Keiko was not only an unwilling captive, but was in fact living in a subpar aquarium in Mexico. And thus a campaign to truly free him began, and sympathetic children were at the forefront of this fight. I was one of those kids who longed to see Keiko swim free, so much so that I went on the local news to spread awareness and raise funds for the orca's rehabilitation and release. My efforts were so passionate that they actually caught the attention of Lauren Schuler Donner, one of the executive producers of the Free Willy movie, who actually took the time out of her busy schedule to call me at home and thank me for my hard work and dedication. As a teenager receiving a phone call from an executive producer of a movie that I was absolutely enthralled with, beyond words. Finally, in 1999, Keiko was healthy enough to return to his birth waters of Iceland and live the life of a free whale. Although he passed away from pneumonia in 2003, Keiko's release is considered a success, given his young age of capture and his 20-year history of being held in various tanks, which left him with only a very slight chance of surviving any length of time in the wild. Despite my fierce campaigning for Keiko's freedom, I didn't fully understand the damage caused by holding orcas in captivity. Like most of society, I believed the propaganda telling me that marine mammals enjoy the company of humans and that it's important to keep them in tanks to study because, well, science. I was convinced that most sea-themed entertainment parks took impeccable care of their animals, with immense concern for their health and well-being. And it was only in isolated cases like with Keiko that a captive orca suffered loneliness and abuse. I believed this so fully, in fact, that when I moved to California as a young adult, I eagerly applied to work at SeaWorld and was hired as an entertainment manager, scheduling and overseeing the daily animal shows. And although I loved being so close to the whales and dolphins, this job was short-lived. And my work behind the scenes, well, it left me rather disillusioned about the industry. Nonetheless, I remain largely unaware of the cruel history surrounding orca captures and the many societal and biological reasons why these creatures should never be kept in tanks for human entertainment. I walked away from my time at SeaWorld believing the company line that people would never value and protect marine mammals in the wild if they were unable to see them up close and watch them perform these silly circus tricks. Now, before I explain my path to enlightenment about the many evils of holding an amazingly intelligent creature captive, I want to take you back to the beginning and describe the unusual circumstances that transformed orcas from feared predators of the sea to the cuddly stuffed toys in theme park gift shops. The first ever orca capture took place in 1961 when a lone female was spotted swimming around in California harbor. A Los Angeles aquarium, Marineland of the Pacific, had achieved notoriety by being the first park to catch and display pilot whales, so they of course jumped at this opportunity to expand their collection of exotic ocean mammals. They sent a team out to capture the 17-foot-long orca. The young killer whale, later named Wanda, repeatedly evaded capture, delighting the spectators, the thousands of them, watching from shore. The public was firmly on the side of the orca, loudly rooting for her to triumph over the capture team. But when she finally succumbed to exhaustion from fleeing, Wanda was netted and transported to Marineland. Her stay there was a short one, as she sadly died 2 days later. It's actually speculated that Wanda's death may have been suicide, as park staff report, quote, "The whale became violent, and after encircling the tank at great speed and striking her body on several occasions, she finally swam into a flumeway, convulsed, and expired." End quote. The next orca taken into captivity was never even intended to be captured alive. In 1964, an approximately 5-year-old male orca was harpooned off the coast of British Columbia. The Vancouver Aquarium had commissioned a sculptor to create a replica of a killer whale to display in one of their halls. It was determined that a model was needed to create the sculpture, and after Marineland's failure with Wanda, plus subsequent and unsuccessful attempts by the park to capture an orca whale, the idea of keeping a live specimen to observe and measure for correct proportions was, well, unrealistic. Obviously, the only solution for getting a safe and up-close look at an orca whale was, of course, to kill one. Oddly, it was the sculptor himself who, if you'll forgive my pun, spearheaded the operation of harpooning the specimen. The artist was accompanied only by an aquarium volunteer named John Bauer, when he shot a spear through the head of a small orca swimming by with its family. Miraculously, the harpoon failed to kill the resilient young whale, and the two men watched as the rest of the pod, which is the name for a group of orcas, rallied around their fallen mate, holding him at the water's surface to help him breathe. When the pod eventually gave up and moved on, they left the two men with a dilemma of how to finish off a little orca who began leaping and trashing and thrashing about, trying desperately to extract a harpoon from its head. Help, if you want to call it that, came in the form of locals with rifles and a prejudice against pesky killer whales. The men were fully prepared to keep shooting until their victim was dead, but Joe Bauer had a change of heart. Moved by the injured orca's cries and the human-like concern he'd witnessed from the youngster's pod, Joe rowed out into a skiff and heroically placed himself between the whale and the gunman. In light of this standoff, plus the fact that the targeted orca was small, only 15 feet long, the curator of the Vancouver Aquarium decided he would attempt to keep the live animal in captivity. 2 days later, 20,000 people flocked to the aquarium to get a look at the little orca, who had become mistakenly determined to be female, and was named Moby Doll. It was, of course, a one-day show, as the responsible choice was made to move the orca to a larger and more secluded sea pen, where he could be studied for science rather than exploited for entertainment. Well, at least until he grew healthy enough not to draw sympathy and concern. Sadly, though, no efforts could save Moby Doll, who survived for only 3 months under the supervision of humans who knew absolutely nothing about caring for an injured orca. The only bright side to Moby Doll's story is how he started to change the standing perception of killer whales. Through observing him, people realized that they were wrong to see orcas as no more than dangerous killing machines. But again, unfortunately, this new understanding of orcas was overshadowed by the pervasiveness of human greed. Even with their limited knowledge on how to successfully care for an orca, various marine parks nonetheless had made generous offers to buy Moby Doll from the Vancouver Aquarium, and his brief time in captivity gave new energy to the ongoing attempts to capture wild orca whales alive. At a time when orcas were believed to be dangerous, bloodthirsty killers and were habitually, if not often, successfully hunted by fishermen who simply wanted to eliminate the competition for salmon, only one man expressed a more enlightened opinion of the gigantic sea mammals. Ted Griffin was the founder of the Seattle Marine Aquarium, and he was obsessed with orcas. Ted was an adventurer more than a businessman, and he took great delight in collecting his own aquarium specimens. Now, this was easy enough with octopi and a harbor seal, but an orca whale? Despite the seeming insanity of the venture, Ted was not only brave enough to intentionally get close to these supposedly murderous orcapods of the Puget Sound, but he also believed that if he could just manage to catch one, he could befriend and train his own pet orca. Ted's early attempts to capture a live orca were, of course, unsuccessful, but the experiences instilled in him an understanding of an orca's intelligence, resourcefulness, and human-like compassion that they displayed for members of their pods. Unfortunately, Ted's enlightenment did not extend far enough to convince him of the obvious, that it would be wrong to kidnap an orca from its family and turn it into a pet. But Ted, nonetheless, really wanted himself a whale. When Moby Doll was captured in British Columbia, Ted actually sailed up the coast from Seattle and snuck into the army base where the young orca was being held for study. At this point, Moby Doll had been in captivity for over a month and had not yet even accepted food. Ted reports that he was the first person brave enough to hand-feed the little orca, which then began a pattern of vigorous salmon consumption that continued until the day the captive passed away. Ted actually considered stealing Moby Doll for his own, but realized the obvious impracticalities of getting away with such an audacious crime. While still failing to capture an orca using his own resources, Ted had to wait less than a year after his encounter with Moby Doll to possess a killer whale. In the summer of 1965, he scrounged up the $8,000 he needed to purchase an orca that had become accidentally trapped by some fisherman's net in Namu, British Columbia. Ted dragged his prize quite literally home to Seattle in a traveling sea pen, while the orca's mother and 2 siblings followed along behind. The concerned family members wisely departed just as plans were being made to capture them as well. Ted's arrival in Washington state with Namu, the orca, was met with immense fanfare and public jubilation. Everyone was thrilled to meet the magnificent whale, and Ted was hailed as a conquering hero. The mayor of Seattle even gave him a key to the city. Defying the common belief of the day, Namu proved to be a gentle giant, not even showing aggression when he was intentionally provoked. In the absence of his pod and family members, the orca formed a unique bond with Ted that would captivate and entrance millions, completely reversing the public's previous misconception of killer whales as violent predators of humans. A NOAA scientist put it like this: by the single act of going into the water with Namu, Ted Griffin contributed more to the conservation and appreciation of killer whales by societies of the world than all the biologists and conservationists put together, from the dawn of time to that moment. End quote. But this new conception of orca whales came at a high price for not only Namu, but for all subsequent orcas to be stolen away from their families. The mid-1960s began a marine park craze of giant black and white performers. And with no breeding programs yet in place, these whales had to come from somewhere. And that somewhere began in the waters of Washington state. I want you to imagine for a moment that a rogue gang of violent human traffickers invades a peaceful neighborhood, while many generations of a tight family unit frolic in the afternoon haze of summer. As the elders attempt to defend their family and protect their children, this band of predators engages in a campaign of sheer terror with military precision, using high-speed vehicles, aircraft, and explosives to herd the young members of the family away from the adults. There are casualties, of course, amid all the chaos. Now, these deaths are accidental and regrettable, but nonetheless considered by the invaders to be merely the cost of doing business. Gripped by the horror and helplessness, the remaining elders watch as their young are rounded up and taken away to be sold to the highest bidder. Such a scene, in human terms, seems unimaginable. But it was nonetheless a cold reality for many families of orcas once the market for performing whales exploded. And just who led the charge as these atrocious kidnapping operations became commonplace? Well, none other than Ted Griffin, the orca lover himself. His story is a case where passion collides with prudence. Despite Ted's love for Namu, the world's first performing orca lived for only a year, because, again, nobody understood the physiological and psychological needs of such an amazing marine mammal. Ted did try. When he believed that Namu's decline might be due to a loneliness for a mate, he finally accomplished the feat of capturing a wild female to be his pet whale's companion. Ted's good deed was a failure in several ways. First, the young female's mother was accidentally killed during the capture process, and this tragedy was for naught because the new orca didn't even like Namu and acted aggressively toward him. Nobody had studied orcas well enough to know that females are dominant in their societies, and that a southern resident orca, does not speak the same language as a northern resident. In essence, Ted had arranged for Namu to get a mail-order bride from a different culture, and the two just didn't mesh. He sold the female orca to SeaWorld in California, where she became the first of many shamus. Ted Griffin did not learn from his many mistakes and became one of the first sea cowboys as he converted his company Namu Inc., once a marketing tool, into a whale capture and selling enterprise. Building off their ever-increasing understanding of whale behavior and psychology, Ted and his crew became the top new predators of the sea, using helicopters and sticks of dynamite to frighten, herd, corral, and enslave wild orcas throughout Washington's Puget Sound. Although they tried their best not to cause physical harm, these missions were not without casualties. While I feel disinclined to give Ted Griffin any credit, given the great damage he caused, I must admit that his approach to capturing orcas was much different from the norm of his era. At the time of his operations, the live animal trade was a grisly business, driven by nothing but pure greed. Ted, however, made numerous decisions in his career as a sea cowboy that benefited conservation and the well-being of the orcas over increasing his bank account. For example, Ted sold only 7 of the 40 orcas that he rounded up in 1968, whereas other whale dealers would capture, sell, and kill entire pods. As they say, everybody loves a hamburger, but nobody wants to watch a cow get slaughtered. Ted Griffin was terrorizing families of orcas in his own backyard, in view of the public, and his actions, combined with those of other ambitious sea cowboys, began to draw public scrutiny, and negative scrutiny at that. By 1967, Ted's popularity was starting to fade, and by 1970, following 2 tragic and deadly roundups in Penn Cove, Washington, the mighty hero had fallen hard in the court of public opinion. His biggest enemies were no longer fishermen who shot orcas, but activists who threatened his livelihood and even the lives of his children. In 1972, after the Marine Mammal Protection Act made it much more difficult to profit off of the harvest of wild orcas, Ted quietly retired. But his partner continued to capture orcas as special government permits allowed, and as the United States closed its waters, the marine mammal trade simply moved to other countries. For all the harm Ted Griffin's love of orca whales brought about, he did succeed in changing the public's opinion of orcas sooner than it would have happened naturally. As Griffin's own wife said to a reporter back in 1970, quote, "One of the greatest tributes to Ted's recent activities is, in fact, the criticism of those who bemoan the fate of the killer whale. 2 years ago, no one would have cared." End quote. I myself harbored a similar opinion, even after resigning from my job at SeaWorld. I still believe that people would value and protect wild orcas more diligently if they could watch and love them up close at marine parks. But while my attitude toward captivity had not yet changed, I discovered the books of two new personal heroes. Rick O'Barry, a former marine mammal trainer turned animal activist, and Alexandria Morton, a marine biologist who dedicated years of enlightening study to orca whales, starting with a pair of captives in the early 70s, but quickly moving her research focus to the wild pods of British Columbia. I also began following the work of half-brothers Ken Balcomb and Howard Garrett, who both led orca conservation organizations in Washington State. It wasn't long before I moved to Washington State myself, lured, of course, by the rippling harmonics and infectious enchantment of the southern resident orca clans living in the Pacific Northwest. It was the culmination of a life dream, the desire to be close to the majestic species of dolphins that had fascinated me ever since childhood. I finally had the opportunity to view wild orcas swimming secure and happy in their true environment, and it was Cindy Hansen, a naturalist guide on a whale watching tour, who finally convinced me very adamantly and in no uncertain terms that orca whales should not be kept in captivity. Cindy became a very good friend, and it was through her that I met and joined Howard Garrett and his partner Susan Berta in their anti-captivity and other activism campaigns, until my own health became too poor for me to continue traveling to those events. But those are experiences that I will remember and treasure forever. As a convert to the anti-captivity cause, I am now fully aware of the reasons why orcas are so incredibly harmed by being kept in tanks, especially the unfortunate ones that were captured from the wild. First of all, orcas are highly social animals who live in tight family units, most remaining in the same pod with their mothers for their entire lives. Taking an orca from a pod is simply no different from separating members of a human family. You may argue that the orcas at SeaWorld and other marine parks have plenty of company and will simply make friends with other whales, but that's just, well, it's just not that simple. Just like humans, orcas from different regions speak vastly different dialects. One captured orca is very unlikely to speak the same language as the other he is being housed with. And it's also common practice in marine parks to ship orcas between parks, get this, using airplanes, including separating calves from their mothers. An orca pod in the wild is always moving, traveling as far as 100 miles per day. A wild orca will dive deep into the ocean at depths far surpassing even the deepest of holding tanks or pens. There is no conceivable way to imitate an orca's natural environment and lifestyle in a setting of captivity. Whether kidnapped or born into captivity, the average lifespan of an orca decreases significantly from those living in their natural environment. Wild female orcas live for an average of around 50 years, while there's a maximum of 90 years, while males average 30 years with a maximum of 60. Captive orcas, on the other hand, tend to die in their 20s. It is estimated that at least 173 orcas have died in captivity since the 1960s. 3 wild orcas who have beat the odds and lived, although miserably, in captivity for an above-average amount of time are Corky, captured in 1969, Lolita, captured by none other than Ted Griffin in 1970, and Kiska, captured in 1979. But even when they stay alive, orcas in captivity exhibit signs of poor health, such as severe dental issues, collapsed fins, and poor muscle development that affects their ability to swim in straight lines. They also suffer from depression. Poor birth rates and high infant mortality are also common in captive orca populations. Orcas, like other dolphin species, also use echolocation to explore their underwater surroundings. In the most simplistic of terms, the animals send out clicks of sound, and the vibrations that bounce back help them to see what's in the environment. When confined to a tank, though, not only is there nothing to see and no live prey to detect, but when a marine mammal sends out a sonar signal, the results will bounce back and forth off the walls, creating a much greater echo than their echolocation was ever designed for. At best, a captive orca's echolocation skills are wasted, and at worst, the ricocheting sounds will drive them crazy. The Spatial Sound Institute of Budapest, Hungary, describes it best when they say that captive orcas are trapped, quote, in a prison created of their own sound, end quote. And finally, orcas in captivity display behavioral issues that are never observed in the wild, including aggression towards humans that even sometimes results in death. And on that note, I would like to introduce to you today's special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Ventry, a former SeaWorld trainer who worked with Tillicum, a wild-caught orca that suffered from psychological trauma and is famously known for being involved in the deaths of at least 3 people, and is the star of the movie Blackfish, for which Jeff Ventry participated. Jeff has also participated in orca conservation projects in the Pacific Northwest and is co-founder of the advocacy group Voice of the Orcas. And Jeff joins us right now after the break. And welcome back. Today, we have a very special guest, Dr. Jeffrey Ventry, who is going to continue this conversation about orcas in captivity and captivity in general. And we're also, if we have time, going to talk about his position on Medicare for All. But first, I would like to introduce the trailer for Blackfish right now.
When you look into their eyes, you know somebody is home.
They're an animal that possesses great spiritual power, not to be meddled with.
Orange County Sheriff's Office.
We need SO to respond for a dead person at SeaWorld. A whale has eaten one of the trainers.
Tillicum, though, is the one that went after her.
Dawn is the senior trainer here at Shamu Stadium.
She captured what it means to be a SeaWorld trainer, that it made me realize what happened to her really could have happened to anyone.
I've been expecting somebody to be killed by a Tillicum.
We weren't told much about it, other than it was trainer error.
It didn't just happen. It's not a singular event. You have to go back to understand this.
The speedboats herded them in, and they could just pick out the young ones.
This is the worst thing that I've ever done.
When Tillicum arrived at SeaWorld,
He was twice as large as the next animal.
We stored these whales in what we call a module, which was 20 feet across and 30 feet deep, and the lights were all turned out.
Probably led to what I think is a psychosis.
All whales in captivity are all psychologically traumatized. It's not just Tillicum.
If you were in a bathtub for 25 years, don't you think you'd get a little psychotic?
Dawn would tell you that it was her mistake.
They blamed her.
It's just a bold-faced lie.
I was just instructed to get rid of the tape.
the industry has a vested interest in spinning these. That sells a lot of Shamu dolls. It sells a lot of tickets at the gate.
There's no record of an orca doing any harm in the wild.
And the co-host of Blackfish, Dr. Jeffrey Ventry, joins us right now.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me on. It's fun to watch the trailer. I hadn't watched it in a while, and as a matter of fact, we're coming up on
the 10-year anniversary of the film. It made a lot of waves, and it actually changed the law in California. It was the inspiration for some of the Canadian and French legislation that has happened since then. And I think the New York Times said it was one of the top 10 most influential movies of the entire decade, last decade. So the movie made a lot of waves, and of course we're quite proud of it, but there's a lot of work still being done.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little teared up just watching that. The movie is really hard to watch for me.
Yeah.
I love these animals. This is one of the reasons I moved to Washington State, to be next to the Southern residents. And I don't think it was until I moved to Washington and I went on a whale watching trip to see the orcas for the first time. And the tour guide, her name was Cindy. I can't remember her last name, but she has been a very strong advocate for the Southern residents. And she was telling the story. And I was horrified to learn how these orcas were terrorized, herded into these nets, and it's just very emotional for me because, I mean, we're talking about terrorism on the open seas, torture.
Yes, for profit.
And for profit, exactly, for profit. Mm-hmm. And I'm now ashamed to admit it, but I actually worked at SeaWorld for a period of time as an entertainment manager in San Diego. And I had no idea,
Yeah.
I had this idea that, well, this is educational. It's helping to conserve these animals. I bought into the lie, and it was all lies.
Yeah, me too. I mean, obviously, having that behind the scenes look, having worked for SeaWorld as a trainer was bittersweet, because when you finally do see them in the wild, you're on one hand blown away and inspired by it, but you're also like, how could I have contributed to this industry, in my case, for 8 years? And interestingly, when I was at SeaWorld, there was not one staff level trainer that had ever seen a wild killer whale. And I think that's the way that SeaWorld prefers it. You kind of keep buying into the narrative that they had control of for about 50 years until Blackfish came out. Really, that was kind of a game changer because it ended up sparking that emotional chord in people. And the way that Gabriella did it without a voiceover, it was just kind of us talking, and she mixed that together so incredibly well. Jeff Beal's score was amazing. And it was 70% of the film was filmed on San Juan Island. And, it was masterfully produced movie, but it also covered all the bases pretty much. And it kind of showed that terrorism. Howard Garrett describes it in Blackfish, how they had the roundups, and John Crow was in there, the Navy diver that helped with the roundups. And just to make a connection for you, a new movie just came out about Corky, and it was at the Friday Harbor Film Festival in October. And I saw Wild Whales on October 22nd. It was pretty amazing, but it's kind of like a follow-up to Blackfish, and it's worth watching now. Whether it catches that right distributor like a HBO Max or a Magnolia or something like that, who knows? I mean, that was one of the CNN replaying of Blackfish is what I think made it kind of go viral, so to speak, because it played like 20 times, and I think over 150 million people have seen it at this point. So it penetrated deep into the psychology of the world's psychology, basically, because a lot of people saw it and talked about it, and that's what made it so inspirational. So hopefully this movie Corky will get some traction. It kind of goes through her process. Corky was collected in '69 and has been at SeaWorld since SeaWorld bought Marineland in California in like mid '80s, I think it was. Anyway, it's a similarly moving story. I'm just trying to get a plug for it because people can watch it now on Amazon or Vimeo. It's called Corky, the Corky documentary, and it's kind of on par with Blackfish in terms of the messaging and the filming.
You know, one of the stories that I was telling my producer when I worked at SeaWorld, there was one incident that should have been an awakening for me, and sadly it wasn't. I got a call to rush to the dolphin show. A baby dolphin had actually fell out of the tank. And one of the things that I was ordered to do was immediately confiscate any video footage that the audience had of this event.
Yes.
And of course, the train, and I was amazed at how quickly a lawyer arrived to oversee this. I was like, we have lawyers here? And it was just downplayed. And it was another lie that I bought into. And fortunately, the dolphin was not injured. How often do these types of incidents occur at SeaWorld?
Well, just to use Dawn's tragic death as an example, there's cameras all over SeaWorld. There's cameras on the Space Needle. There's cameras all over Shamu Stadium. Dawn went through a horrific 8-minute kind of death process, but SeaWorld didn't call 911 for 27 minutes. And so that gave them time to use their ushers, some operation staff to get people out of there. Of the 42 interviews that were taken, I think like 40 of them were all from staff trainers that were brought in to actually say what happened. And that's where they manufactured the whole ponytail story, which was just a way.
I know, that was foolish.
Yeah. So, but there's lots of stories of, before, I think it was 86, there was a whole laundry list of accidents where, like in the movie, John Sillick, who is now an orthopedic surgeon in California, he was the guy that got smushed between Orky and the other whale that he was riding. And he's got like 10 pounds of orthopedic hardware in his body now to kind of keep his pelvis together and stuff like that. But they paid off all the people that got hurt and gave them a lot of money. And that's why you don't hear a whole lot, in my opinion, from, like Dawn's husband, Scott, and people that were injured, so on and so forth, because they now make them sign like, I don't know what you would call it, like a hush orders to become a trainer now. Like you sign a legal document, and the ones that were hurt like before 86, they pretty much paid off. And so that's why more trainers haven't come forward. And then when Dawn was killed, they waited 27 minutes so they could manufacture the narrative of what happened. At first they said she slipped and drowned, which wasn't the case. I mean, he brutalized that poor girl. And then, when Daniel Dukes was killed in 99, they said the same thing, died of hypothermia. But these people had limbs folded in half, and Dawn's arm was missing and she was scalped, and they tried to downplay it, like almost like a largemouth bass striking at her ponytail, like as this animal instinct, trying to make it seem like it was the trainer's fault in pretty much every occasion, including Alexis Martinez, who was killed just 60 days before Dawn at Laurel Parquet, which is also covered in blackfish. He was brutalized by the orca Quito, and because I'm currently putting together an affidavit for a particular whale, I'm looking through a lot of this old material right now, and they totally blame the trainer pretty much every time, and say the trainer didn't read the whale properly. That led to frustration. That frustration led to the whales acting out. The truth is that the stresses of captivity just lead to this crazy behavior. I mean, there's no evidence, no reported evidence of a killer whale ever hurting anybody in the wild, even though they're kind of terrorizing these sailboats in the Straits of Gibraltar right now, because one guy reported that an orca was harpooned and speculated that these disabling of these boats was a response to that. That's just speculation. One guy said that. I don't know if that's true or not. They might just be, they're pulling off rudders and sailboats and what they're doing. And they've sunk a couple sailboats, but they still don't hurt the people in the sailboats, which is pretty remarkable.
We're talking about, these are incredibly intelligent social mammals.
Yes.
And I'm glad that you pointed out that there's never been a record in history, an incident where a wild orca has killed a human being. Quite to the contrary, in fact, when you read stories like, and sadly, I just want to mention too, we just lost Dr. Ken Balcomb.
Yeah, this week.
Yeah. I was fortunate enough to have met him. I've also met and worked with Howard Garrett as well. But with Ken and Alexandra Morton, another orca researcher who wrote an amazing book, Talking to Whales, I believe it was called, there's a relationship formed between these wild animals and the people that work with them. Ken Balcomb talked about that quite a bit. And I know that some people might think, well, you're anthropomorphizing this whole thing, but there's too many stories to discount. And
can I share a quick story with you? I'll take 1 minute, because what's happening right now is I'm having to go through documents because there's an attorney named Steve Wise. He's the head of the Non-Human Rights Project, and what they're hoping to do, maybe with the orca Corky, who that documentary is about, try to gain habeas corpus, which is the right of bodily liberty, for an animal, and an orca is going to be the person that they write this affidavit, this petition for. And so I'm going through SeaWorld's own orca profiles to try to get evidence of how they already treat these animals as non-human persons, even in their own writings. And here's a good example. This is about the orca Kalina, who died in 2010, but this was written in 2009. They say, beginning in 2009, we began to monitor more closely Kalina's involvement with the training and development of both trainers and calves, even those not mothered by her. So they're talking about the whale training the trainers that they're working with, as well as kind of being an aunt to other small whales and training the other whales. So I've never before seen an example where in like the orca, the profile of an animal, it's talking about using the animal as someone in the human resources department to help train, to help train. It's just funny to me because SeaWorld is very critical when we anthropomorphize about these whales. And then here it is in their own orca profiles all over the place. And I just think it's, number one, it is how they treat them. And number two, it's, just some hypocrisy, more corporate hypocrisy. But it's just pretty funny to me because I think that's good evidence right there for the affidavit that I'm going to write.
Well, this brings to point, why do we always tend to discount animals as, we treat them as property, we exploit them. What we're doing to their natural habitat is horrific in itself. Why can't people understand that animals deserve to have many of the same protections and rights that we afford to other humans?
That's right. Corporations have non-human personhood status in our country. Formerly, as a tragic example, slaves did not have habeas corpus or were considered humans. I think for to figure out how much representation a state would have in the U.S., a slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. That's how they calculated the population of a state to know how many delegates that state would have in the U.S. Congress. So there's examples of where we don't give human status to slaves or orcas in this case, and yet we do give them the rights of a non-human person status to like GE, or Amazon. It's doesn't make any sense to me. And so that's what I think Steve Wise wants to do in terms of fighting for habeas corpus for an animal like Corky. And this is not unprecedented. There are some countries like in New Zealand, I think they've declared a couple like river systems, given them non-human personhood status to increase. And what was it? Port Angeles, I think, just last week declared rights for the Southern residents to help add them legal protections under the law. And so I think there were two cities in Washington just this week that their mayor or someone came out publicly and said, we are now giving these animals autonomy so they would have more legal. It's probably like a non-binding resolution, but that's the direction where things are heading. And I'm hopeful that Steve Wise is successful within the U.S. legal system, which is based on English common law. So once you get a precedent set somewhere, then that precedent is carried forward in the system. And so that's what the idea is.
Speaking of the Southern residents, and I'm probably going to get emotional on this because the idea that we're probably going to lose them is just atrocious to even think about. What would a precedent like this mean in terms of extra protections, and what would it mean for Corky and other orcas and animals that are in captivity?
Yes, so I believe it would be a step to getting them out of captivity and moving them to a whale sanctuary is what it would be. The ones in, and so it would make it illegal to buy and trade them in the future, and it would catalyze the movement of, say, for example, these orcas that live at SeaWorld now to go to the new whale sanctuary project in Nova Scotia, or maybe even in the San Juans that they're looking at. So that's what the thought process is. That's the strategy, I believe, that they're trying to do, is break through with that first case. I think Steve and his group represented a whale called Happy in New York. And so they're trying different animals in different regions of the country, possibly thinking that California's court system might be more favorable than something on the East Coast. And the orca's obviously got a gigantic 15-pound brain. And what I'm trying to do is provide examples from captivity that shows their intelligence, and then also demonstrate that they're already getting treated as non-human persons in SeaWorld's own literature when they're asking the whale to train the trainer. I mean, it just kind of tickles me to even think about that. So that's the strategy for that. In terms of the Southern residents, I agree. Unfortunately, I don't think they have the reproductive capacity to come back. They got the double whammy of the 4 lower snake dams were built in the 70s, which coincided with the collection period, mainly by SeaWorld. And so SeaWorld even put out a paper, a scientific peer-reviewed paper back in the early 70s to justify its collections by estimating that there were over 500 animals. And that's one of the reasons why Ken followed Mike Biggs' work in counting whales, because the theme parks were making, like, claims that could be disproved. It turned out that there was only like 130, and SeaWorld pulled 60 of them out of there, so they were knocked down to about 70. And they didn't all go to SeaWorld. It was Ted Griffin and those guys that actually were hired by SeaWorld to do it. And then those whales got distributed to parks all over the place. And so they eventually got kicked out. But those collections helped to catalyze the Marine Mammal Protection Act. But then they just started doing it in Iceland, and that's where Tillicum was collected at the age of 2, I think, and shipped to the park in Victoria, Sealand of the Pacific, which is where he killed Kelty Byrne in 1991, and then he killed Daniel Dukes in 99, and then Don in 2010. So, yeah.
People are going to hear, some people will say, well, and I remember this happening when Don was killed. People were, well, maybe we should put the animal down. Blaming the animal, not the system.
Yes. So my involvement in Blackfish was centered around that idea. SeaWorld put the lockdown on anybody in the zoological community from talking about it because they wanted to control the narrative. And I was already a resident at LSU in New Orleans for medical resident. And what happened is CNN called the Center for Whale Research for a comment on Don's death by Tillicum, and Howard Garrett referred the CNN Anderson Cooper's show producer to me. And at first I declined the interview, saying I didn't want to get involved. I was a medical resident. It doesn't look good. You're out there kind of doing like whistleblower type work, and you're just a couple years away from trying to ask a hospital system for a job. I didn't think that was a good position. But then Michelle and my significant other and my sister and John Jett, who's also in Blackfish, said, "Dude, we've been talking about the cruelty of this industry for 10 years. You should say something." So I emailed the CNN show producer back and said, "Okay, I'll do the show." And then at CNN, like a whole series of interviews followed that, because they got somebody that was talking. So I got a call from who's the other older guy on CNN? I don't know. He's got his own show, CBS early show. But my first point was trying to fight for Tilikum not being euthanized, because there was a push to do that. And I was just coming on and saying, this is a function of Tilikum's environment. He's got broken teeth. He gets picked on by all the other whales. It's a high stress, world. It's got a collapsed dorsal fin. He's chronically on medication, and it's just a bad life for a whale, and he shouldn't be held accountable. Of course, SeaWorld did not want Tilikum to be put down either, because he was their show finisher. He was the guy that came out at the end, and so fortunately they didn't put him down, and he did end up living 7 more years and dying in January of 2017. But it was still a crappy life for a whale. And I know what you're saying. There was a call to euthanize Tilikum after he killed.
And the reason I bring that up too is because people do not understand the stress that these animals are under in captivity. Many are surprised to learn that there have been dolphins that have actually committed suicide by ramming themselves up against their the walls of wherever they're being capped, whether it's in their pools or I know that there's even been cases where prior to being taken into captivity, they've committed suicide.
So that was the claim. I think Rick O'Barry made that claim about Hugo,
yes,
Lolito's tank mate at the Miami Seaquarium. He bashed his head so hard that I believe he gave himself a intracranial aneurysm and bled out. And then there's a couple of pictures online if people want to look this up. There's just a really unremarkable, tragic picture of him just being hoisted out, like a fish on a end of a pole and just put into a landfill. And that was an example that Rick claims was an act of suicide. But I think that supports what you're saying, that there's been other animals that just lose it. And a lot of humans got a little bit of a taste of, during the lockdown period, of what it means to just not get out. And that's living in your house, with a lot of freedoms there. I'm just saying the whales, there was one whale that was tracked. I don't know who, it was a paper that was written on just how far they can swim in one day. And the longest that I'm aware of is that one whale traveled 142 miles in one day, and that was tracked. And these animals, Tilikum, the 5 of the 7 pools that Tilikum lived in were not even as deep as his length. So he had calluses on the tips of his tail flukes just from dragging the bottom. And 2 whales at SeaWorld, Kanduke in 1990 and then Taku in 2007, because the whales do a behavior called logging at night. Mosquitoes are attracted to dark surfaces and CO2. So you got a dark whale floating at the surface all night long, exhaling huge breaths every couple minutes. And so it's like an attractant for, especially in the climates where theme parks are, like Florida, Texas, and Southern California, where there are mosquitoes. And so these 2 animals died of West Nile virus and St. Louis virus encephalitis injected in them from the mosquito vector. And these papers were published, and we pointed that out. Mosquitoes, because John Jett and I wrote a paper on this, they're weak flyers, so they don't swim out into the open ocean. And killer whales spend over 90% of their time underwater when they're in the ocean, and they're always on the move. They very rarely log, and when they log, there's wind and there's not mosquitoes out there. So this is a completely contrived, avoidable death. And it's not just killer whales. There's a lot of animals that die from mosquito vector viral infections in zoos all over the place. And there's a lot of literature in the peer-reviewed literature on this topic. And Taku and Kanduke are two whales that fell victim to encephalitis. So that's kind of tragic right there. And then the
And
teeth.
one of the ways, oh, sorry, I was going to say one of the ways that SeaWorld sort of gets away with this is, the whole Shamu brand. People are assuming, oh, well, that's Shamu, that's one whale, and that whale has been alive for, forever. When in fact, SeaWorld goes through orcas on a pretty incredible pace.
Yeah, they do. John and I wrote a paper on captive orca survival as well, and Dr. John Jett, he's in Blackfish. Anyway, the original Shamu was collected as a calf. I think it was Ted Griffith harpooned Shamu's mother to get from a helicopter, and then they pulled the calf out, and the calf was a couple of years old. That whale only lived to age, they estimated age 9, so it lasted probably like 7 years in captivity. And then what they did to continue that marketing and to control the narrative, they just call every animal in the main performance pool Shamu, or the most trained whale, or the whale that they happen to be using at that time. And so that's, to your point, and as John Jett says in the movie, it allows them to sell a whole lot of Shamu dolls in their gift shops, but and it kind of covers up the how they die young in captivity. And so I'd guess that the average life expectancy for a captive whale is probably around 15, and that's taking into considerations some whales like Corky that are remarkably long-lived in Katina in Florida. I mean, some of them make it, but a lot of them die super young, and the average age would probably be about 15. Maybe, and it's gotten better over time, but not much better. They've improved their husbandry, and very early on, some of the basic science that came out of being able to test their blood types and so forth was helpful. But most of the science that SeaWorld has done, and it's not much, it's a very paltry amount of evidence, scientific papers that they've written, are really just based on how do we keep this animal alive in captivity, and how do we figure out how to breed them in captivity. So they can, because they can't collect them anymore. And so that's what their papers tend to focus on, like semen extraction. And they had to put the whales through artificial insemination practice and extract semen from the males, and then send it through a tube into the females. I'll put some pictures, if you want me to, in that bio piece that your producer was talking about earlier. If people want to see some of these pictures of this, I'll include some of those if I can add a picture.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's, what do you say to people who go to SeaWorld to see these animals? Isn't part of the solution getting people to a point of awareness where they're not supporting SeaWorld and these other marine aquariums by just, stopping the influx of consumers that are visiting these parks?
Ironically, I don't know if you saw this last week, but the movie Avatar: Way of the Water was premiered at a theme park in Tokyo. I mean, this is in Japan, where the Taiji, and I can't remember, Cameron, who's the director of that movie? James Cameron. Yeah. And so Rico Berry goes, I've been doing this for 50 years. He's supposed to be a vegan, and you're opening the biggest movie event of the Christmas period at a theme park in Japan, and you got Sigourney Weaver and James Cameron, all these guys clapping on stage for dolphins doing flips. It was like a disconnect for Rick O'Barry. And so I guess Rick's conclusion was that there's a lot more work to be done. And of course, he invited James Cameron and Sigourney Weaver and the cast to come watch, the collection process that happens in Taiji, which the trainers at this park are a part of. Most of those whales the dolphins get slaughtered, and then they keep the best looking ones for the theme parks. And so it was so to get back to you, what do you say to people? It's really hard. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that goes on with what I would call the pro-captivity community. This isn't a scientific endeavor. It's not really even an educational endeavor. It's the sea circus, and that's what we sometimes refer to it as. This is a takeoff on Barnum and Bailey. This is a takeoff on the the gladiators, but in fact, the Shamu Stadium in Orlando is like it's a Roman Colosseum. That's the architecture of the stadium. I mean, this is entertainment, and even in like some of SeaWorld's press kits for the Believe show, they kind of talk up the killer whale is the most dangerous animal on the planet, and that's what makes our show so amazing. So on one hand, it's kind of like going to a NASCAR. There's a horrific crash here, and people kind of get off on that or whatever, but something could go wrong at any minute, and they're kind of using that as a way to pull people in, the entertainment aspect of it. And so, even to be a trainer, I mean, we had, after a while, I mean, there's a honeymoon phase when you get hired as a trainer because you're excited to get the job. I mean, when I got hired, it was the late 80s. There was no internet. I believed everything SeaWorld was saying. That was a time when you could watch Jacques Cousteau on TV still, and SeaWorld always kind of presented itself as a bastion of scientific research, and you get there and it's more like a circus. So people that stay there have to tell themselves a lot of stories to be able to be in line with what they're doing. And unfortunately, being a SeaWorld trainer doesn't really prepare you for any other activity. So you either got to go to another zoological type place or go into sales or something, because it's not like it gave me any help with like med school or anything like that. I had to go back and kind of rebuild my education after working there. So yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in both the pro-cap community, the people that attend these parks, and also in the trainers that continue to work there in the face of the evidence that they have now, especially. I mean, these animals are given gelatin supplements because captive whales don't swim very much. So their caloric intake is a lot less in captivity. The waters are warm. The dorsal fins are above the surface most of the time in captivity, which is why they collapse. And the collagen that supports the fin denatures when it's exposed to a lot of heat. So if you can imagine whales sitting there pretty much floating all the time with the Florida sun or the San Antonio sun or the San Diego sun all day, it heats up that black fin. And then it, especially in the males that have a much taller fin, over time, there's 100% of male orca fins that collapse in captivity, and it's super rare in the wild. And even in the wild, it's usually due to humans. Like when the Exxon Valdez spill happened, there was whales filmed with collapsed fins because they were exposed to all that toxin. Or a whale might get hit by a propeller every now and then, or a lot of fishermen used to shoot whales. And so you take a couple gunshots in the back, that could cause a collapse. But it's less than 1% of all killer whales in the wild have a collapsed fin, and collapsed dorsal fins are the norm in captivity, not the exception. So it's pretty tragic what the whales go through, and you can see how they might get frustrated. And in Dawn's case, it was tragic.
Yeah. What was and what is now the requirements that SeaWorld looks for to become a trainer?
It's funny that you just said that, because this is all part of some of the research that I've been doing. There is nothing. I don't know if I could pull it up for you. I should just send it to you as part of one of the documents that I send. But it's really about towing the company line. There's no particular education required for it, which I didn't know when I went in there. Because I've been, back in the day, I went to Florida State and then thought that was a requirement. But really, they're looking more for people that would look decent in a wetsuit and can talk and swim. So to get hired, you go through a pretty rigorous swim test, and then if you pass the swim test, then you got brought in for like a face-to-face interview after that. So it's really just personality, voice, physicality, ability to swim, and tow the company line, basically. I'll give you that document though, what the requirements are, and I'll post it with this episode, so people can read specifically what it says.
Because I think a lot of people are under the assumption that, oh, well, these trainers are biologists. They're marine biologists, or in that sort of vein, and that's kind of a image that SeaWorld perpetuates.
Yes, it is.
Educational.
Exactly. Yeah, and some people do have biology backgrounds, but a lot of the trainers, especially the ones that end up staying there a long time, because there's really limited things that you can do. Having trained sea lions or dolphins or whales, especially if you don't have an education, because anyway, you gotta go back after SeaWorld and go to school if you stay there long enough and want to do something else, because being an animal trainer, it's a position that people do because they love animals. But then when you get there, you find out that you're doing the opposite of loving animals. You're perpetuating their misery. And so that's one thing that people should realize. And it's tragic, the lives that those animals lead in captivity. And I've seen it firsthand.
Yeah, well, and it's also, you have a bond with these animals.
Yes.
I mean, between the trainer and the animal. And Rick O'Berry talks about this. It's hard on the trainer too. So even when you're become aware that this captivity is inhumane, you still have a bond.
Yeah, and John Jett in the movie Blackfish, he mentioned something along those lines. He goes, look, I think the question that he might have been referring to was, well, why did you stay? And he goes, I just wanted to take care of Tillicum. I just wanted to take. I mean, I think I can do it better than somebody else, And then that was his justification for staying. But yeah, I think the trainers go in with good intentions usually, because usually they're animal lovers. But the thing where you kind of become a bit crestfallen is when you realize that you're just performing stunts, that are all based on anthropomorphism. I mean, the whales are doing head shakes and shaking no and doing flips, and it's a spectacle. And then so that's when you have to, where the cognitive dissonance kicks in, and you try to tell everybody that this is all based on natural behaviors and the rationality that they use to keep the show going, so to speak. And it's still going, unfortunately. Blackfish did some good work, but it didn't get the whales out of captivity. I think that's where Steve Wise is going to try to change that with entering into the legal system.
And I imagine SeaWorld is going to fight that tooth and nail.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly when this is going to happen, but there were some experts that were asked to participate, and I was fortunate and honored to be one of those. And so if it happens, it will probably happen in a California courtroom in 2023. So we'll see what happens. And now that your viewers will have a tip to, when they hear this story come out next year, they'll have heard it here first. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Why has there not been a push for Congress to initiate legislation, especially with the new awareness that's come out?
Well, this is a really great question. As a matter of fact, one of the assembly persons in the state of California, which I think is what they call their congressman, the guy that helped push through the Blackfish bill, there was Richard Bloom, but then there was another guy. Maybe he was a Democratic congressman from California. He was the one that was pushing for, and this is a nice segue into Medicare for all. He was the one that torpedoed the Medicare for all movement in California, but yet he was championing the orca thing, And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, yeah, SeaWorld's $1 billion corporation. They've got money, and we're like, on this, to use the Star Wars analogy, the activist community is kind of disorganized and underfunded and disagrees with each other a lot. And whereas corporations have, literally billions of dollars and can control the Congress to a certain degree just by, we've got our whole system is pretty much bought and paid for, if you ask me. So that's probably the answer, both at the state level and the federal level.
Yeah, we're not really governed.
No.
By a functional government. We're governed by corporations.
Yes. Yeah.
And the state of politics in this country, for me, is just utterly disgusting.
Yes.
And one of the things that I love about you is that you are not only a whistleblower, but you're a champion for social justice.
Yes, for sure. I think we're in trouble.
And yes,
like, ecologically in trouble, and not just the southern residents, because they're starving. But I mean, we're collapsing parts of the biosphere. What is it, like 70% of all land mammals have been wiped out since like 1970, I think the number is. I mean, you hear different numbers. We're losing the bees. We're losing farmland. And the price of capitalism is high. There's no. So it seems to me that one of the central concepts of biology is homeostasis, which just means being in balance with nature. And right now we're not in balance. We're consuming nature and commodifying it, and that means there's a lot of external cost to that, like we're toxifying our river systems. I mean, to me, a dam is nothing more than like an embolic stroke in the brain, and you've got 8 main stem dams in the Columbia Snake System, each with a 12% mortality, including their dead water reservoirs behind them. And smolts can't make. I mean, if you're a smolt born up above Lower Granite Dam, you can't. Your odds of making it back are 0. I mean, you got to go past 8 on the way out and 8 to get back, and it's tragic. Rivers are living systems, and when you inundate, I mean, why in the heck do we have? I mean, Lewiston, Idaho is like 700 and some feet above sea level. So these are run-of-the-river dams, lower snake dams. They have no flood control because they all have to be, the water level has to all be at the top behind the dam to get up to 720 feet of elevation where Lewiston is. So they sell like Bonneville says, oh, we can control floods. They have no flood control. They produce power in the spring when people don't need it. People need power in the summer and in the winter when it's hot and when it's cold. So and they're losing like $100 million a year just to operate these dams. And most of the energy is being sold to California for a loss. They make no sense. And the big agriculture and stuff like that has such a control over the messaging and all this stuff that if they got rid of the lower snake dams, our rates would go down, not up. And there's enough wind now. That's why the price of power is going down, is because the West Coast has a lot of wind power now. And one good thing about the dam infrastructure is that you can tap these big 2 and 3 megawatt wind turbines right into the already existing, basically the wiring for the dams is already underground. And so that it's easy to put these. That's why you see a lot of wind along the Columbia River Gorge, for example, because they've got a lot of infrastructure from the dam systems there. But like we saw in the Elwha dams came down, and that system is now blowing up. I mean, the salmon are back. I mean, they're super resilient. You just have to give them half a chance. And the same thing, they're going to take down, I think, is it 4 dams in the Klamath River now? And hoping that happens soon in Northern California, because that river was decimated by dams as well. So things are moving. My concern for the future, though, is that they don't seem to be moving fast enough, because there's a lot of profiteering going on, and a lot of like we talked about earlier, control over, our politicians these days are basically getting paid by corporations to live out that agenda that they want, and not what's best for the people and the animals. So.
And people will, especially I hear all the time. Oh, is there staticky?
I can hear some static. It just started.
Okay, bear with me. We're going to go to a card and be right back.
Okay.
Hello. Okay, I think that's much better. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? Oh.
I'm here.
Oh, here we go. Perfect. People will say, well, the Democratic Party is so much better than the Republican Party. And that is utter nonsense at this point, because both parties are completely controlled by corporations. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I love that. There's a little meme. It's got a B-52 bomber dropping a bunch of bombs off of it, and it's like the Republican one is just all black dropping bombs, and the Democratic B-52 has like a rainbow painted on it. You know, it's like it's the same uniparty in my opinion, offering different versions of the same thing basically. I mean, there's nothing really. I mean, the Democrats are just a big disappointment to me. They are supposed to be the champions of the people, or labor, and they've just totally gone the other way. I mean, I've never been registered for either party, but I just try to make decisions based on the evidence, and I don't see either party doing much to help. I mean, what do we get? You know, with Obama, we got a GOP healthcare plan that led to the record profits for the healthcare industry, and I spend a good part of my day, or actually my nurse and my assistant spend a good part of the day just getting pre-authorizations from different insurance companies so I can do my job. I mean, this is time that's being taken away from patient care just to haggle on the phone and go through a series of menu options where you got to wait 20 minutes before you even get a person. And then, or they make you do like a peer-to-peer consult to explain why you want to help your patient. And you always win the consult, but it takes like 20 minutes to do it. And so you're like, and then because it's a for-profit system, you know, we're just being clocked all day long. I mean, it's just like, there is no break in the day, and you get double booked and you get behind, and every day. That's why so many doctors are exiting stage left. I try to do the best job that I can with my patients, and that's why I got into medicine. But the third-party payer system is corrupted and inefficient. And there's been like 22 studies now that have validated like a Medicare or a single payer, taxpayer-funded system that is much more efficient. I think administrative costs are 3 to 5% for a nationalized system, whereas they're like 15 to 18% with all the private companies or the corporations that are running health, the Aetnas of the world, you know. And so it's really super inefficient. And I think as a physician in Washington, I think they have to re-credential me every 6 months for like 40 different companies. I mean, that's a huge process right there. I mean, the patients that I see mainly come from probably a half dozen to a dozen main other payers. But I mean, you still have to get like 40 different companies, and they all have different criteria for getting credentialed. And of course, the hospitals have to hire credentialers just to do that full time to keep their doctors working. And then the system's kind of rigged these days where to go out on your own is so laden with extra work. It's like it keeps the hospital systems, you know, the doctors kind of having to be dependent on the hospital systems instead of being able to go out and practice like in a private practice. I mean, there's some doctors that do a nice job in private practice, but for the most part, it's a pain in the ass to go out there and try to go out, take another, you know, I probably had $400,000 worth of debt when I got out of med school. And, you know, you get paid off with that. And then the last thing you want to do is go have to borrow another $100,000 from a bank to buy a building or lease a space. And then you got to hire people, and then you got to do credentialing and blah, 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 blah. And by the time you're done with the math on that, it's just difficult. And the outcomes are worse. I mean, when you're hiring doctors and basing how much doctors get paid on a productivity basis, it shortens the visit time. I mean, how often do you even talk to an MD anymore? You usually get a mid-level, and then, you know, maybe you do the initial consult with your doctor, and then you just pass through the system as many times as your insurance will allow. And then when your benefit runs out, you know, say someone's getting like treatments for low back pain or epidurals or something like that. You know, right now people are all trying to get in before the end of the year because they've paid their deductibles, and so like when I go to work tomorrow, for example, it's just going to be, can you get me in? I mean, I work with my patients, but I'm just saying it's so inefficient and kind of frustrating.
This is fascinating to get the perspective from a doctor, because the mainstream media tells us, well, let me ask you, what do, in general, and I don't want you to, I know that you can't speak for all doctors, but do you think that most doctors would support a single payer system?
Yeah, this has been polled. There's data on this. I think about 60% of physicians support a single payer system. And one reason for that is because each graduating class from med school and residency has a higher percentage of new docs that can see the light. Unfortunately, at the heads of these hospitals, at the heads of these old school docs that are banking a ton of money. So the hospital systems have their corruption as well. I mean, so, maybe you've got 6 admins at the top of a hospital system all pulling in over $1 million salaries. The doctor's pay over the years hasn't really gone up, but the heads of a lot of these campuses, like the docs that have been there long, whether it's surgeons or pain docs or whatever, they're making a lot of money, and they don't want the system to change at all. They don't want a more equitable system, because everyone's just kind of looking out for themselves. I think as this evolves more, even a higher percentage of docs are going to be kind of more vocal, like I am, about getting the system changed, because I think the solution to our healthcare system is a taxpayer-funded nationalized system, or it's going to collapse. I mean, there's clinics closing all over the place. There's doctors exiting stage left. Costs are going up. I had to just change a dental appointment, just a normal routine dental appointment, and like 2 months ago, and I can't see my dentist for like till April. It's like getting in to see me is like 4-month wait. And I had a snow day recently because we got that dump. I don't know. Are you guys on the west side? Well, I don't know where you're transmitting from.
Yeah,
but
we're up in Mill Creek.
Yeah, so I got stuck because of snow. I just felt bad for my patients because I couldn't get to work, and I'm getting them, squeezed into my schedule now. But they're already waiting 3 or 4 months just to get in, and our system's super inefficient, and it's getting worse.
Well, and we don't even have enough new doctors in our med schools to compensate for the doctors that are retiring.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers on that, and I think that's true. But yeah, there's a doctor shortage in general, I would say, because a lot of just based on the amount of solicitations that I get from like headhunters and people that are looking to place doctors. I get literally half dozen emails every couple of days about, do you want to come work here? which is nice to have some options, but yeah, I think the system is collapsing, and a lot of the systems don't want to, where they're nitpicking and not providing us with help is like the staff, like the patient services coordinator, like the girls that do coding, girls that do the front desk, the greeting work and the phone calls and stuff like that. I mean, a good PSC to doctor ratio, there should be like two of those. I think the patient services coordinators should be 2 for every physician to keep the clinics flowing and getting pre-authorizations done and stuff like that. I think right now that number is upside down. So they don't want to spend money on a PSC, but they're, on the other hand, they're asking us to produce more, so they're cutting off resources that allow us to do our job while at the same time asking for more productivity. And that's where you start getting shortened patient visits and a lot of number counting going on, and people getting frustrated and staying late, having to work long hours, which is not getting better, it's getting worse.
Would it be fair to say that the system that we have is killing people?
Oh yeah, there's not only is it killing people because of mistakes, which happen all the time, and more mistakes happen the faster you try to work, but also this has been studied in terms of how many deaths are directly related to people not having insurance, and that number is, I've heard 65 to 70,000 a year, just because they don't have access, because because we've got this for-profit system. And the system, so I'm a physical medicine and rehabilitation specialist, and I've said this to a lot of people. So I take care of people that have disabilities. Maybe they lost a leg, maybe they've had a stroke, maybe they've got back pain or carpal tunnel, whatever it is. But trying to get equipment for, like, say a veteran. Well, actually, that's a bad example. The VA does a relatively good job getting vets equipment. But say you have a patient, a family member, or an aunt that has a stroke. If you don't have decent insurance, these, like a power wheelchair, for example, it's like $50,000, and so there's a shrinking pool of money available. And so if you don't have some fancy commercial insurance, you're probably not going to get the assistive devices that you need to maintain your independence. And so the system is inefficient. Patients are scheduled based on the quality of their insurance. People don't know this.
Really?
Yes. So in fact, there's a system in place where they, and I don't want to get too specific, but where people get a street light. If you have like really great commercial insurance, you get a green. If you have middle of the road insurance, you get a yellow. And if you get like a, underinsured, like the Affordable Care Act, you get like a red dot. And they're scheduled in order of preference, so the system can extract more money out of the highest number of patients. And it's also really amazing for me to see how treatments are correlated. Like, for example, most insurance plans, so I'm a physical medicine doc, so I send a lot of people to physical therapy and occupational therapy or speech therapy or whatever it is. And the amount of treatment that patients will get isn't based on their need, it's based on how many visits to PT they have. Like if you have someone that's had a stroke, they might need speech pathologist for a year, but it only pays for a dozen visits. And so that's what you get. It's not based on the need of the patient, it's based on how much the system can extract from that third-party payer. And people don't realize that. I mean, if you have two twin brothers break the same bone and show up and need care, the one with the better insurance plan is going to get seen first, and the other one's going to have to wait. And so that's sick.
Would it be fair to say that in so many respects, your ability to treat patients as a physician is really limited?
It's
under the system,
impaired by yes, absolutely. It's the insurance companies. I was asked by a friend who had a girlfriend, like a fairly young 40s girl, that needed a liver transplant. And because someone saw me on social media and my girlfriend said, Jeff, because you have some docs following you and stuff like that, had me like send out a message on social media about this girl needing a liver transplant. And she finally got approved, but there was like a 3 or 4 month delay in getting the approval because the insurance company kept denying until it came up on social media and they had pressure put on them. By the time it got approved, she died. I mean, she didn't last long enough to get the liver transplant because it was caught up in red tape. And the people, as far as I know, the way the system works is that people that work for companies, commercial insurance companies, are incentivized to deny first and ask questions later. So the default response to can we do this is no, and then you put the onus on the provider to make their case down the road. And so that just creates a ton of inefficiency. And yet these people that are making these yes and no decisions on the front line, aren't even nurses. They're not even medically trained. They're working for a system that is a profit-based system. And so that's tragic because it leads to a lot of unnecessary inefficiencies in the system. And in the case of the girl needing the liver, it cost her life because the delays. So
as a physician, because again, I hear a lot of my fellow Democrats defending the Affordable Care Act as some great system that came from the bastions of liberalism, and which, as you said, it was a conservative healthcare plan.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that people don't understand about the Affordable Care Act?
Well, it's limiting. It's the coverage that it provides is minimal, and like in certain systems, like I was using the red, green, the green, yellow, and red light. That's a red light. I mean, the systems that are treating the patients don't necessarily want to work with the Affordable Care Act. So when I see a patient, I don't know what insurance they have. They just show up and they're scheduled, and all that is. I mean, I'm not making any judgments based on knowing anything about the patient, but I'm just saying that's how it's done. And the insurance, I mean, even like Mayo Clinic, I think, put out a position piece on that. Like, look, we've got to survive too. Like, so having to calculate the amount of money that you can extract from a particular third party, it doesn't seem a good, effective way to do anything. And I think since the Affordable Care Act was in place, I mean, insurance company profits have gone up, not down.
Yes.
And it really doesn't work. So, I mean, I'm hoping for a nationalized plan, but I mean, I just don't, I think wasn't Obama promising, he was what was the option that it wasn't true single payer. He was offering
the public option.
Public option, yeah. And then as soon as he got in there, he scrapped it and let it go. But I think, I mean, look, we're sending 110 billion of our tax dollars to kill over in Ukraine and Russia, in a area of the world that is not of strategic interest to us, just so some imperious elite billionaires can work their way into that market system and control the world. It's unreal. I mean, the highest military budget in history just got signed off on, right? Like even by the Squad. The Squad was supposed to save everybody. The highest in history, like almost $1 trillion a year to execute war and domination, around the world. And how many times we're going to fall for this, like, war propaganda that we've been getting since even before Vietnam. It's just like the war machine is out of control. I think war is bad. I heard a number, an incredibly larger number than I thought, of people being already killed in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. It's just unbelievable that we're, now I know why we pulled out of Afghanistan so fast, because it would be easier to launder money through Ukraine. So I don't know what's going on. I just, wasn't the U.S. military is the largest single emitter of CO2 in the world, and we're, on one hand, we're trying to slow down the effects of climate impacts, and on the other hand, we're begging for more money to send us, HIMARS systems to Ukraine, and developing hypersonic missiles and all kinds of technology for killing. And I guess we should have known when Biden installed, was the CEO of Northrop Grumman as the defense secretary.
Oh, I know.
So we've got this fusion of corporate power and government and the media. I mean, it's all one big happy. I mean, isn't that what they define, like like the actual definition of, one of the definitions of fascism is when you combine those three forces, when you're controlling the flow of information and the flow of money, and really, 100,000 more cops was what he asked for. Like, come on.
Yeah, we need at least 500,000 more cops, right? I mean, yeah.
Anyway, I don't know. I mean, that's all kind of depressing stuff, but I mean, I think it needs to be talked about. So thanks for having this conversation, at least. I hope more people will begin to really see what's happening. It's amazing how, like you said, the ACA is defended, and everything's so polarized. I don't know how we get out of it. It's almost like the divide and conquer strategy is the strategy, and it seems to be working effectively. But at the neighborhood level, regardless of people's political affiliations, people, I think, have a lot more in common than we hear in the news media anyway. Because now it seems to be about clicks instead of, I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, where it was just the news, and not all this spin, basically, that is undermining, relationships, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I said this to you in our discussions before you agreed to come on the show, but you really are one of my heroes.
Oh,
the way that you've speaking out, you, Rick Berry, and so it's an honor.
Yeah.
To meet you and have you on the show, and I just want to thank you so much.
Yeah.
For all of the work that you do and for being an advocate, because I imagine as a physician, it's probably somewhat dangerous to come out and support a Medicare for all, given the system of insurance companies that we have.
It is so weird because I do bring it up, and it's not even being talked about. In like, who's going to be the first hospital system that really just says this is the solution? Because it is the solution, and they don't want to even go there. And yeah, you got to be careful with what you say. Almost. I mean, I'm usually pretty open about everything, but it's really amazing the suppression of the conversation. And people worry about themselves first. They worry about losing a job or whatnot. So yeah, I don't know what the solution is. I will try to get one point to you before we're done, and that is because of Ken's passing and because of the 10th year of Blackfish, which turns 10 in 2023. There's an event that I host in Friday Harbor that I think is going to happen. We're looking for a venue, maybe the San Juan Community Theater in mid-July of next year, where a lot of the top orca scientists from all over the world, including like Ingrid Visser from New Zealand and Naomi Rose and people like that, gather and give presentations. And we're going to hopefully do that this year to honor Ken. The only reason I can't give you a date is because I'm kind of going back and forth with the community theater right now because of the right dates and how much they're going to charge. So I just wanted to get an early plug for that in case you wanted to attend. And
oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a lot of there's people there that come to see whales, and there's people there that speak, and there's usually, I guess, at our peak, and we haven't had it in a long time because of COVID. The last one was supposed to be in 2020, and then the outbreak happened and travel got restricted, and so we're going to try to do it in July of this year. I'll circle back on this one to confirm it with you, but yeah, and your audience can learn about it as well. There's a lot of videos from past talks online already called Superpod, whatever, talk by Ken Balcomb or by Ingrid Visser or Howard or whoever it might be on YouTube. So if people want to investigate that, they can.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please reach out to me because I really would like to attend that.
Okay, yeah, I will. I'll circle back as soon as I have something solid on the books, and we're working on that right now.
Great. Thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. And again, thank you for everything that you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. This has been Coup Save America. We'll see you next Tuesday.